Hi, everybody. It's Becky with New Hampshire Audubon, wondering if I am coming through okay. My screen looks different than it usually does. So if you're out there and can let me know if you're seeing me and hearing me, that would be fantastic. I'd love to know that because it's not looking like it did the last time I did this. And if any of you have watched me before, you know that sometimes I have technical difficulties. So if you're able to send a comment that says, yes, you can see me and yes, you can hear me, that would be just fantastic. Uh, so I'll hope that you can, and I'll start. I want to answer a couple of questions that came up last time that I had to do a little research into. So again, it's Becky with New Hampshire Audubon. If you can see or hear me, please let me know. Um, and then I'll know that everything's working okay. I've got a message on my screen that is different. Okay, it looks like I'm doing okay. So I'm hoping that I am. Again, if somebody can send me a comment, if you can hear or see me, please let me know. So hoping that you can, trusting that you can. One of the questions we had last time was about turkey vulture youngsters and what do they do after they fledge and start flying around. So I did a little research and checked into it, and they will roost after they fledge. They'll roost near the nest site for about 1 to 3 weeks. They finally leave the nest when they're about 12 weeks old, but they don't usually roost with their parents. They usually roost in a communal nest site. So they'll roost with other young of the year rather than with their parents. And the parents don't usually feed the young or after they sort of leave and go into this communal roost site. They may still feed them when they're around the nest, but once they leave the nest, the adults don't feed them, and they will perhaps follow the adults. The young ones will perhaps follow the adults to food sometimes, um, but they're much more independent um, and sort of with this other group of youngsters when they're doing a roost. Um, Another interesting thing that I found out when I was looking into this was that perching with turkey vultures is hierarchical. So the older adults have the preferred nest sites and they will kick the youngsters or younger birds or lower, less dominant birds off any preferred perches and take them over. Uh, so hi, welcome folks. It's Becky with New Hampshire Audubon. Somebody can send me a comment. Let me know if you can see or hear me. That would be great. Um, and I'm answering a couple of questions that came up the last time we did a Q&A. We were talking about turkey vulture young, and I researched that. And the other question we had was about whether there's a caterpillar outbreak going on. There have been a lot of sightings of yellow-billed cuckoos, and cuckoos are actually they're specialists on hairy caterpillars, but any caterpillars will do. So usually their population increases when there's a caterpillar outbreak. And one of my colleagues did a little bit of looking into this and found that at the Hubbard Brook Experimental Forest in New Hampshire, they're seeing extremely high numbers of caterpillars, not hairy caterpillars, but the kind of caterpillars that you find in forested areas. Um, there's a one called a prominent that seems to be in pretty high numbers, but in general, they're seeing at Hubbard Brook at the experimental forest the highest number of caterpillars they've seen in 20 years. So that's a great source of food, not only for all sort of small songbirds, warblers, they feed their young caterpillars, but I'm sure it's very attractive to the yellow-billed cuckoos. And the other thing that happened is last year there was somewhat of an outbreak in the lower Connecticut River Valley. They sort of, it was a gypsy moth outbreak. The south of New Hampshire, um, in Connecticut and western Massachusetts. And the gypsy moth caterpillars are one of the hairy caterpillars that cuckoos eat. They're one of the few species that will eat the gypsy moths. And so we may be seeing an increased population of yellow-billed cuckoos that sort of has expanded into New Hampshire. They had a good year last year with all the good caterpillars in New Hampshire. They're moving through and moving into our area. All right, so hi, it's Becky with New Hampshire Audubon. If anybody can send a comment, let me know if you can see or hear me. That would be great. I'm not getting any comments, so I don't know if there's something wrong with my system. But if anybody can send a comment, that would be fantastic. Hoping that you can hear me. There are a few things going on in the natural world that we definitely want to talk about. And one of the things that we're seeing right now is quite a few red crossbills. They're in the southern part of the state, they're in the mid part of the state, the northern part of the state. I even had one in the seacoast area where they're not very common. And red crossbills feed on cones. And last winter we had a great cone crop in the White Mountains and to the north in the spruce fir cones. And there were great reproduction in the winter. Now, crossbills are one of the few species that will actually nest in the winter when there are good cone supplies because that's what they feed their young. So they don't have to wait for those juicy caterpillars to come out. They can breed in the winter time. And so there had been youngsters around, but also we have a great white pine cone crop this year. And so there's lots of white pine cones that are starting to ripen. So the crossbills will rove and fly, they can fly hundreds of miles looking for good cone crops. And so we think that not only the adults that probably nested last winter, but also the youngsters that were raised last winter are in our area because there's great white pine cone crops. And you could see them just about anywhere in the state right now, which is pretty uncommon. Usually in Concord area or south and towards the seacoast, I don't see them very often in that area. But this is the time. The tricky part with them is that you really need to recognize their call because they're flying around a lot. And the red crossbills have a chip chip, chip chip chip, chip chip, chip chip. It's very hard, a hard sounding chip call. And they'll be flying overhead giving that call. So listen to it. If you can find a recording of it, listen to it on the web. See if you can recognize it. I also got to actually see a couple of red crossbills. They come to grit. This is that small, fine gravel pebbles that they put in their crop, and it helps them break down the seeds, helps them grind up the seeds that they eat. And so they come down to roadsides for grit. And I was actually at the boat launch at Turry Pond in Bow and had two red crossbills come down quite close to me getting grit from the gravel boat launch. They were also flying around making their little jip, jip, jip call, but it was a real treat to see them come down to the ground. So watch them and look for them. Okay, hoping you all can see and hear me. It's Becky with New Hampshire Audubon. If you have any questions, don't hesitate to send them with comments. I'm not seeing any comments, so I don't know if I've got something odd going on right now that's not allowing me to see comments. If so, I really apologize and hope that you'll send a message via Facebook, or you can send an email to us at birds@nhaudubon.org, and one of the volunteer naturalists will help you with your question. Couple of other things to mention. I'm seeing quite a few hummingbird moths in the garden now. And we oftentimes get questions from people about little tiny hummingbirds. Well, these moths, the hummingbird moths, look like little tiny hummingbirds, and they hover around flowers and gather nectar just like a hummingbird does. And they have a very long proboscis that they unroll and put into a flower to get nectar. They're also called clear wing moths, because their wings have clear patches in them. And they hover and get the nectar. And there are a couple of different colors. There are a couple of different species that we have, and they're different colors. One looks rusty colored, so you might be tempted to wonder if it's a rare rufous hummingbird. But they're so tiny that will kind of give them away as being an insect and not a hummingbird. But they're around quite a bit. They like bee balm. They like many of the flowers that hummingbirds like, and that bees like. And you'll oftentimes see them hovering among the bumblebees as they're coming in for nectar. And we've got a video up on YouTube of a hummingbird moth if you want to take a look at New Hampshire Audubon's YouTube channel. All right, let's see. I'm just checking to see if I can get any comments, and I'm still not seeing any comments. So I'm hoping that that's working. Yeah, I'm sorry if it's not. I'm sorry if you've got comments and you're trying to get them to me and I'm not able to answer them. Technology and I definitely on these live Facebooks sometimes have interesting challenges. We had a hurricane. Well, it wasn't a hurricane by the time it got to us, a tropical storm. So some of us who are excited birders were out looking to see if there were any unusual birds that got carried up in the tropical storm. Sometimes hurricanes will have birds that get entrained in them, and they will come all the way from the Caribbean up with the storm, and you can see some very rare birds. This storm appears to have gone inland too much to really bring any birds to New Hampshire. There were certainly some interesting ones in western Massachusetts, black terns, sooty tern, and some of the areas to our south, but haven't heard of any unusual birds yet that came into New Hampshire from the storm. But definitely worth checking anytime we get a big storm that comes in like that. All right. As many of you will have noticed if you're up early in the morning, the song activity of the birds has quieted down. That morning chorus, there's only a few species now. And bird song is really quite interesting. It's fascinating, but it's driven by the hormones, the breeding hormones, at least for most of our songbirds. There are a few that will sing year round, like the cardinal oftentimes, but even its song decreases in the wintertime. When the hormones for the birds start really increasing in the spring, that's what drives their singing. And as we get into summer and fall, those hormones are rocketing down. They're decreasing, and so bird song decreases as well. I had a cardinal and a Carolina wren calling this morning. Those are year-round residents, so they may be likely to sing a little bit longer. They're not preparing for migration. But some of the other wonderful songsters of the early spring are being very quiet. All right. So birds are being quiet. The adults are molting. They're getting ready for migration. And the youngsters are feeding themselves. The adults and the young will start building up fat now, getting ready for migration. They go through a phase called hyperphagia, where they can eat and put on lots of fat. Would be like us nearly doubling our weight in a couple of weeks. And they'll need that. That is their fuel for migration. They don't usually carry around fat when they're going about their normal daily business, but when they're prepping for migration and during migration, they need that fat. So they'll put on the fat, they'll burn it when they go through their migration. And getting a good amount of fat is a great, great thing for migrants when they're getting ready to move along. And in fact, habitat that helps birds put on fat um, before migration, particularly our neotropical migrants. These are birds which go all the way down to Central and South America or the Caribbean. They need lots of fat and they really need habitat where they can put on weight. And it's been shown that birds put on weight fastest with a combination of fruit and insects. So our coastal plain where there are lots of fruit-bearing shrubs or areas that have some shrubby growth, shrubs that have berries on them, as well as bushes and trees that have caterpillars. That's great habitat for migrants to put on fat in preparation for their migration. So anything you can do to help provide that in your yard um, will help birds. Sometimes migrants, if they run out of energy, they have to land kind of wherever they are. And if there's a food supply where they land, that can really help them. So even if you're in an urban area, putting in berries that bear fruit or native shrubs that have caterpillars on them, native shrubs or trees that can really help our migrants. You can create a little oasis for them during migration. Water is another great thing to put out for birds, not just for migrants, but year round. Sometimes, like this year, we've had a very dry year. So putting water out is a great thing to do to help them. All right, it's Becky with New Hampshire Audubon. I'm still not seeing comments, so I'm afraid I'm not getting comments right now. So I'm sorry about that. Please email in your comments or Facebook your comments or your questions, and we'll do our best to answer them. We've gotten a lot of questions lately about immature hawk identification. This is the time of year where the hawks are out of the nest. They're sort of semi-independent. They're able to fly, they're learning to hunt, but they're still sitting there screeching away for their parents who are providing food for them still, supplemental food. The amount of food they provide will probably depend on what the youngsters need. But if you hear a hawk, I've been hearing quite a few red-tailed hawks screeching away, and they're just, that screech is to let the adults know where they are, and it's also a begging screech so that the adults will bring them more food. But immature hawks are very difficult to identify because they all tend to look very similar, and that is brown on the back, white on the breast with brown streaks. Immature broadwings look that way, immature sharp-shinned, immature Cooper's hawks look that way. Even immature red tails can have the brown streaks on the breast. And the red-tailed hawks don't have a red tail in their first year of life. So you can't use that feature to help identify them. So size and shape is one of the biggest things for identifying, but it really is not easy. And the adults are the same size as the youngsters. The youngsters may even be a little bit bigger than the adults at this point now when they're out of the nest and fledged. So it's really challenging to try and figure out what type of young hawk you've got in your yard. And sometimes the young hawks are not at all afraid of people. They haven't learned yet, and so they may just sit on your railing looking at you. Um, and sometimes the adults can be defensive of them, but less so now because the youngsters are much more able to fly. So if there's danger, the youngsters can fly and be safe, so the adults are less concerned about them. And some of the young hawks are totally independent at this point. It really just depends on when they hatched and how well their hunting skills are coming along. And I mentioned I was at Turry Pond and saw a couple of red crossbills. Well, I also saw an immature Cooper's hawk flying around hunting. No adults nearby, was flying just fine. It was learning and probably had been successful hunting on its own at that point. So it was being fairly independent. Um, so when you're looking to identify immature hawks, um, the best thing to do is to try and look at the length of the tail. And again, this can be tricky because if it's a young bird, maybe its tail isn't fully grown yet. But in general, the most common young birds that you'll see will be the four I just mentioned: the red-tailed, the broadwing, the sharp-shinned, and the Cooper's hawks. And sharp-shinned and Cooper's hawks have long tails, and broadwings and red-tailed hawks have short tails. Cooper's hawks immatures and sharp-shinned hawk immatures are really hard to tell apart. That's a challenge. There are a few field marks, but you have to sort of put them all together. And even sometimes we'll get pictures and can't tell which species it is. So that can be a real challenge. But if you can narrow it down to sharp-shinned and Coopers, that's a great start. And then broadwing hawks tend to be the hawks you might see sitting on a wire as you're driving around a forested area or neighborhood. They have short tails. The adults have real broad black and white bands on their tail, but the youngsters don't have that. Um, and so you oftentimes see them on wires, but the hawk you see most often from roadsides is the red-tailed hawk. They usually will perch on poles, not on wires. They feed on small rodents, so they're oftentimes along the sides of the roads, on the edges of fields, by open areas. And they're one of the most common hawks to to see easily, particularly when you're driving around in your car. So if you see a hawk that you're not quite sure of and it's on a roadside sitting on top of a pole looking down like it's looking down in the grasses, chances are pretty good that you've got a red-tailed hawk. Uh, and right now, with the youngsters being out and about, they're a little bit more visible, and I'm hearing them call quite a bit in a number of different places. So those are hawks to look for, but don't worry if you get frustrated by identifying immature hawks. It's a real challenge. If you can get a picture, don't hesitate to send it along. As I mentioned, you can email it to New Hampshire Audubon. You can send it to birds, etc. at nhaudubon.org. You can send a Facebook message. I'm sorry that appears I'm not getting comments here because I'm happy to answer anybody's questions, but that just is not in the cards right now. Let's see. Any other? I'm just checking my screen to see if there's anything I can click that might get comments, but I'm just not getting them. Nope. I'm going to post a comment myself and see if that helps. Huh. Well, that's interesting. All right. Well, if you have any questions, give it a try. Try sending a comment. If it's not working, I totally apologize for that, and I don't know why it's not. One other thing I'd like to mention about is we talked about song activity quieting down and nesting quieting down, except for things like crossbills, which may just be gearing up with the cone crop coming into ripeness, our pine cone, the big pine cone crop we have. There are a couple of other species that are also traditionally really late nesters, and that's the American goldfinch and cedar waxwing. And American goldfinch could be just starting to nest right now. We've even had last year, I think it was October, we had a nest with youngsters still in the nest in mid-October. Unfortunately, it didn't make it. We had a cold night, very cold below freezing night, and the youngsters didn't make it, but they do nest late and can be quite successful if they're wrapping it up probably before the end of September. And then cedar waxwings also are late nesters. They feed on fruit. And so they want to have their youngsters when there's lots of fruit available. So when fruit on trees is ripening, and this is the time of year when there can be lots of fruit coming into ripeness on bushes, red chokeberry, choke cherry, uh, different other fruits on bushes. And so they may be nesting right now, and you'll see youngsters in another couple of weeks that are all streaky on the breast. Now, the cedar waxwings have a yellow band at the end of the tail, and otherwise they're all kind of satiny brown. They have a little black by their mouth and on their face, and a little tuft that kind of sticks out the back of their head. The youngsters look similar, but they have sort of diffuse streaks on the breast. But they gather in big flocks, so you can watch them flying around. Sometimes you can get flocks of 20 to 30 at this time of year. And as we go throughout the fall and winter, you can get flocks from 50 to 100 cedar waxwings moving around in search of fruit. They'll go for crab apples in the wintertime and sumac in the winter, anything mountain ash that's holding on to its berries, anything that's still got berries on it, they'll be roving around looking for. So again, that's another great thing to plant in your yard if you're looking to help the birds. Crabapple trees, sumac, anything along those lines. But you can keep your eye out for young goldfinch and young cedar waxwings. The young cedar waxwings are likely to be with the group. The young goldfinch are likely to be making their begging call, which is kind of a feed me, feed me, feed me, feed me. If you have a garden or there's a place where community gardens are, particularly those growing sunflowers, you'll have lots of goldfinch around, and you can hear that youngster begging call now all the way through the end of this month easily, and probably and into September actually. So those are some things to watch for. Again, it's Becky with New Hampshire Audubon. I'm sorry that the comments don't appear to be working, but thank you for joining me. If you have questions, don't hesitate to email them in or to Facebook them in. And I'll look forward to our next round of Q&A to hopefully answer questions. If you have ones you want to send in ahead of time, happy to get them. Thanks very much for joining me. Enjoy the birds and watch for some of the fun things that we've been talking about. Thank you very much. Again, Becky with New Hampshire Audubon, and we really appreciate your support. You can donate on our website. Thanks.